You were decommissioned, my son said casually, as if he were talking about an old piece of equipment instead of his own mother. I didn't respond. I didn't ask what he meant. I simply folded my napkin and stood up from the dinner table. No one stopped me. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story, and let me know which city you're watching from so I know how far these words travel. The dining room still smelled of roasted chicken and buttered green beans, the kind of meal I used to make every Sunday without fail. The plates were warm, the glasses were half full. The lights above the table cast a soft yellow glow that made everything look normal, almost peaceful. Almost. It had been just 3 weeks since we buried my husband of 41 years. 3 weeks since I stood at the edge of a freshly filled grave, my knees aching, my hands numb inside black gloves, listening to the pastor talk about moving forward. I hadn't moved forward yet. I was still learning how to breathe in a house that no longer echoed with my husband's footsteps. At 70, I thought grief would be quiet. I didn't expect it to feel like walking through rooms where the furniture had been rearranged overnight. That evening, my son invited me to dinner, said it would be good for everyone. His wife sat beside him, smiling politely, cutting her food into perfect little squares. She didn't look at me when he spoke. You were decommissioned, he repeated, this time with a small shrug, as if clarifying a simple misunderstanding. It's just practical. Practical. That was the word he used. I looked at his face, searching for something familiar. The boy who once cried when I dropped him off at kindergarten. The teenager who called me late at night because his car wouldn't start. I didn't find him there. Instead, I saw a man who had already made a decision and didn't see the need to soften it. My daughter-in-law reached for her wine glass. It's not personal, she added lightly. It's just the next phase. The next phase of what, I wondered? My life? My usefulness? No one mentioned my name on the mortgage. No one mentioned the years I spent paying bills while my husband built his business. No one mentioned the nights I sat up balancing checkbooks while everyone else slept. I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I understood something in that moment. I was no longer part of the conversation. I walked down the hallway to the guest room, the room I'd been moved into after the funeral, to make things easier. The door closed softly behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. They looked older than they had a month ago, thinner, like they belonged to someone who had been slowly erased. Downstairs, I could hear laughter, the clink of silverware, life continuing without me. They thought decommission meant finished. They were wrong. The house felt different after the funeral. Not quieter, just emptier, like sound itself had decided not to linger anymore. I woke up early the next morning, the way I always had when my husband was alive. Old habits don't disappear just because the person you built them with is gone. The clock on the nightstand read 5:42 a.m. I stared at it for a while before sitting up, waiting for the familiar weight of grief to settle into my chest. It came right on time. I walked down the hallway slowly. The floorboard near the bathroom still creaked, the one my husband used to joke about fixing next weekend. Next weekend never came. I brewed a pot of coffee, even though I was the only one drinking it now. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and bitter, but it didn't comfort me the way it used to. His mug was still on the second shelf. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I poured my coffee into a plain white cup and sat at the small table by the window. Outside, the lawn looked exactly the same. The oak tree stood firm. The mailbox leaned slightly to the left. The world hadn't noticed that my husband was gone. My son and his wife came downstairs later than usual. They spoke in low voices, glancing at their phones, already dressed for the day. No one asked how I slept. No one mentioned the dinner from the night before. You okay here today? My son asked, already slipping on his jacket. I'll be fine, I said. He nodded, relieved. That was the answer he wanted. After they left, the silence pressed in. I began noticing things I hadn't before. My coat was no longer hanging by the front door. It had been moved to the hall closet. My mail sat unopened on the counter, stacked neatly to one side, as if it had already been reviewed. Later that afternoon, I tried to log into my bank account online. The password didn't work. I tried again. Still nothing. When I called the customer service number, the woman on the line spoke kindly but firmly. I'm sorry, ma'am. You're no longer listed as the primary account holder." I thanked her and hung up without asking anything else. That evening, I opened the guest room closet, the room that used to be my sewing room. My winter coats were boxed up, shoes I wore regularly were missing. Only the practical things remained. Flat shoes, neutral sweaters, items that took up less space. I sat on the bed and rested my hands in my lap. My fingers felt stiff, like they didn't quite belong to me anymore. That night, I lay awake listening to the house settle. Pipes knocking, wind brushing against the siding. In the darkness, I replayed small moments from the past few months. Conversations cut short, plans made without me, decisions explained after they were already finalized. It hadn't started after my husband died. It had started before. I remembered the day my daughter-in-law suggested I stop driving for safety reasons. The way my son nodded without looking at me. The time they discussed renovations to the house as if I weren't sitting right there. At the time, I told myself they meant well, that this was what getting older looked like. Adjustments, compromises. Now lying there in the dark, I understood something clearly. They weren't adjusting my life. They were reorganizing it. And I was being moved out of the center, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I simply stayed awake, listening, and let the pieces fall into place. The next few days passed without any direct confrontations, but everything felt slightly off, like the furniture had been moved a few inches to the left when I wasn't looking. My son stopped knocking before entering the guest room. He'd pause in the doorway instead, speaking to me from a distance, as if the threshold itself were a boundary he didn't want to cross. His wife rarely addressed me directly. When she did, it was to relay information, not to ask anything. "We'll be eating earlier tonight," she said one afternoon, standing in the hallway. "It works better for our schedule." I nodded. She didn't wait for a response. At dinner, conversations floated around me without ever landing. They talked about errands, work calls, and plans for the weekend. When I tried to add something small, an observation about the weather, a comment about a neighbor, I noticed how quickly the subject changed. It wasn't rude. That was the strange part. It was efficient. One morning, I went to the laundry room and found my clothes folded separately in a plastic basket. The labels on the shelves had been updated. Linens. Seasonal. Donate. I recognized my handwriting on none of them. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the word donate, trying to remember when the decision had been made. Later that day, my daughter-in-law asked if I still needed my car. "It's just sitting there most of the time," she said, scrolling on her phone. We were thinking it might make sense to simplify things. Simplify. Another practical word. "I still drive," I said. She smiled. "Of course. Just something to think about." That evening, I overheard them talking in the kitchen after they thought I'd gone to bed. My son's voice was low, careful. Hers was calm, steady. "She's adjusting," he said. "It won't take long," she replied. "We just have to be consistent." Consistent with what, I wondered. The schedule? The silence? I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to their voices blend into the hum of the refrigerator. They weren't angry. They weren't cruel. That was what made it harder to name. They were managing me. The next morning, a folder appeared on the kitchen counter. Inside were printed pages labeled options. Senior apartments, assisted living communities, places within 20 miles, all with neat descriptions and monthly costs listed in bold. No one handed it to me. It was simply there. My son noticed me looking at it as he poured his coffee. "Just information," he said quickly. "No pressure." I closed the folder and slid it back into place. That afternoon, I took a walk around the block. The air was crisp, the kind that made your joints complain but cleared your head. As I walked, memories surfaced without warning. Teaching my son to ride a bike, sitting in bleachers at his high school games, helping him move into his first apartment, handing him an envelope with cash I'd saved quietly over years. I had always been useful. That night, back in the guest room, I opened my purse and found a receipt I didn't recognize. A storage unit rental, 3 miles away, paid for last week. I stared at it for a long time. That was when it settled fully in my chest. Not fear, not anger, but clarity. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't grief making people act strangely. This was a plan already in motion. And I was no longer being asked where I fit into it. The storage unit receipt stayed in my purse for 2 days before I did anything about it. I didn't confront my son. I didn't mention it to his wife. I waited. On the third morning, after they left for work, I took my coat from the hall closet and walked out to the driveway. My car was still there. The keys were still in my purse. For now. The storage facility was less than 10 minutes away. A low concrete building with faded numbers painted above each row. It smelled like dust and metal when I stepped inside the office. A young man behind the counter asked for my last name. I gave it. He nodded and pointed down the corridor. Unit 214. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. When I reached the unit, I recognized the lock immediately. My son had used the same brand on his garage for years. Inside were boxes, neatly stacked, carefully labeled. Winter coats, books, kitchen mom. I stood there longer than I meant to, reading the handwriting. My daughter-in-law's. Clean, precise, confident. They hadn't waited for my permission. They hadn't even waited for a conversation. I opened one box and found photo albums, the old ones with peeling plastic pages, my wedding photos, pictures of my husband holding our son on his shoulders at the county fair. Another box held framed certificates, retirement plaques, things that once hung on the walls of the house upstairs. They'd been packed like excess inventory. I closed the box and locked the unit again. My hands didn't shake. I felt oddly calm, as if something inside me had finally settled into place. On the drive home, I thought about my husband. He had been a quiet man, careful with money, careful with promises. Before he passed, during one of those late-night conversations when sleep wouldn't come, he'd said something I hadn't understood at the time. "Make sure you always know where the papers are," he told me. "People forget things when they think they don't need you anymore." I'd smiled then, thinking he was just being cautious. That afternoon, while the house was empty, I went into the study. The room had barely been touched since the funeral. His desk still held the same pen holder, the same desk lamp. I opened the bottom drawer and found the folder he'd once shown me briefly, years ago. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at in a long time. Deeds, accounts, notes written in his steady handwriting, instructions, dated and signed. I sat in the chair and read slowly. Some things were exactly as I remembered, others were not. There were clauses, safeguards, conditions that only took effect under certain circumstances. Circumstances like relocation, transfer of control, changes made for convenience. I closed the folder and returned it to the drawer. That evening at dinner, my son talked about work. His wife mentioned an upcoming trip. No one asked where I'd been that day. No one noticed that I listened more than usual. After dinner, my daughter-in-law said, "We'll need to talk about next steps soon." I looked at her and nodded once. "Whenever you're ready," I said. She smiled, satisfied. That night, back in the guest room, I lay awake thinking not about where they planned to send me, but about timing, about patience, about the difference between being removed and stepping aside on purpose. They believed they were organizing my exit. What they didn't know was that I had finally found the map they'd forgotten existed. And for the first time since my husband died, I slept through the night. The conversation happened 2 nights later, just as the dishwasher finished its cycle. My son stood by the counter, arms crossed, waiting. His wife sat at the table, her phone face down in front of her. That alone told me it was serious. She never put her phone away unless she wanted control of the moment. "We need to go over some things," my son said. I took my seat slowly. Same chair as always. Same place at the table, even if everything else had shifted. He slid a thin stack of papers toward me, not legal documents, printed summaries, bullet points, headings in bold, living options, care planning, timeline. They had given my life a timeline. "This isn't sudden," he continued. "We've been talking about it for a while." I glanced at his wife. She nodded once, approving. "We just want what's best," she added. "At this stage, stability matters. At this stage." Another phrase that sounded gentle but landed heavy. I picked up the papers and scanned them. Assisted living communities. Monthly costs listed neatly, all within a budget range they'd clearly decided was appropriate. None of the places were near my church. None were near the grocery store I'd gone to for 20 years. None of them were home. "I see," I said. My son exhaled, relieved. "I knew you'd understand." That was when I realized they'd mistaken my calm for agreement. His wife leaned forward slightly. We've already spoken to one of the facilities. They have availability next month. Next month, she said it the way someone talks about reserving a table. And the house? I asked. My son hesitated just for a second, long enough to notice. Well, he said, once things are settled, it makes sense to streamline ownership. For taxes, for efficiency. Efficiency again. I nodded and placed the papers back on the table, aligning the corners carefully. My hands were steady. I could feel both of them watching me, waiting for emotion, for resistance, for something they could manage. They didn't get it. I'll need some time, I said. Of course, my son replied quickly. Take all the time you need. But his wife smiled, the kind of smile that came from believing the outcome was already decided. That night, I returned to the guest room and opened my purse. I took out the receipt from the storage unit and laid it beside the folder I'd found in my husband's desk. 2 pieces of paper. 2 versions of the future. I thought about the man I'd married, about how he never raised his voice but always paid attention, how he used to say that people revealed themselves most clearly when they thought you had no leverage left. The next morning, I made breakfast for myself only. I cleaned the pan and put it away. I left no trace. Later that day, I took the bus downtown. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I didn't need to. The building I entered wasn't impressive. Just glass doors and a small brass plaque near the entrance. Inside, I sat across from a woman who listened more than she spoke. I placed my documents on the table, the deeds, the notes, the clauses my husband had left behind like quiet insurance. She read carefully. When she finally looked up, her expression changed. Not surprised, but alert. Your husband was thorough, she said. Yes, I replied. He always was. She explained things simply, what applied, what didn't, what could be done quietly, and what would require notice. I asked questions, I took notes, I didn't rush. When I returned to the house that evening, my son was on the phone. His wife was scrolling through listings again. Everything okay? He asked when he hung up. Just fine, I said. And I meant it, because for the first time since that word had been spoken at the dinner table, decommissioned, I understood something they didn't. They thought this was about moving me out. It wasn't. It was about who still had the authority to decide when a chapter actually ended. And that authority hadn't been transferred yet. The house became quieter after that meeting, but the tension settled in like dust. It didn't announce itself. It just stayed. My son stopped mentioning dates. His wife stopped leaving brochures on the counter. Instead, they watched me more closely, as if waiting for a sign that I was preparing to leave on my own. I gave them none. Each morning, I followed the same routine. I woke early. I made coffee. I folded my blanket at the end of the bed. Predictable behavior made people careless. My husband used to say that. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law asked if I wanted help organizing my paperwork. I'm managing, I said. She smiled, but her eyes lingered. Just trying to be supportive. Supportive now meant supervision. A few days later, my son asked me to sign a form. He said it was for emergency access, in case something happened to me. Medical, financial, temporary. I read every line. I signed nothing. I'll look it over, I said, sliding it back to him. His jaw tightened, just slightly. There's no rush, he replied, but his tone had changed. That evening, I noticed my mail had been redirected. Fewer envelopes arrived with my name on them. Some days, none at all. When I asked about it, my daughter-in-law said, "We're just consolidating things. It's easier this way." Easier for whom, I wondered. At night, I returned to the documents in my purse. I reread the notes my husband had left. I followed the dates, the conditions, the careful language he'd used, anticipating decisions made on my behalf. I didn't feel angry when I understood the full picture. I felt prepared. The following week, my son mentioned selling the second car. "It's just sitting there," he said. "We don't really need it." "That car is in my name," I replied. He paused. "I thought we transferred it." "No," I said. "We didn't." Silence stretched between us. That weekend, they left town overnight. A short trip, planned quickly. I stayed behind, as expected. While they were gone, I made copies. Originals stayed where they were. Copies went into a folder I carried with me at all times. I didn't hide them. I didn't announce them either. On Sunday evening, when they returned, my daughter-in-law told me she'd scheduled a tour at one of the assisted living communities. "I can cancel if you want," she said, already knowing the answer she expected. "You can keep the appointment," I replied. She looked surprised, pleased. I went to bed early that night, not because I was tired, but because I needed space to think. In the quiet, I considered how carefully they'd been limiting my access. Money, transportation, information. Not all at once. Just enough to narrow my choices. They weren't pushing me out. They were closing doors and waiting for me to notice. The next morning, I put on my coat and took the bus downtown again. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't need permission. When I returned, there was a message on the counter, a reminder about the tour, a time circled in pen. I read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it back where I'd found it. They believed this phase was nearing its conclusion. They were wrong. It was only the midpoint, and I was done being managed. The tour was scheduled for Thursday morning. I didn't argue. I didn't cancel. I simply nodded when my daughter-in-law reminded me for the third time. 10 a.m., she said. I'll drive. That won't be necessary, I replied. I'll meet you there. She hesitated, then smiled. If you're sure. I was. On Thursday, I dressed carefully. Not formally, just neatly. A simple coat, comfortable shoes. I left the house early and took the bus downtown, not to the facility, but to an office a few blocks away. The receptionist recognized me this time. She didn't ask for my name. The woman I met with closed the door and reviewed the notes we'd already discussed. She slid a single document across the desk. Not thick, not dramatic, just precise. This activates only if certain steps are taken without your consent, she said, and from what you've described, those steps are already being prepared. I read the document slowly. My husband's handwriting appeared again in the margins. Small notes, dates, cross-references. He had anticipated this, not the people but the situation. He trusted you, the woman said. I trusted him, I replied. When I left the building, the air felt lighter. Nothing had changed outwardly. Cars moved, people walked past, life continued. But something internal had shifted. I arrived at the assisted living facility exactly on time. My son and his wife were already there. She looked relieved when she saw me. He looked tense. The tour guide spoke brightly, pointing out amenities, meals, activities, emergency call buttons, everything designed to reassure. I listened politely. I asked no questions. At the end, my daughter-in-law asked about availability again. Next month. Same answer. My son glanced at me. What do you think, Mom? I folded my hands. It's very organized. The guide smiled. We pride ourselves on that. We left soon after. On the drive home, no one spoke. The radio filled the space between us. I watched familiar streets pass by, noticing which turns they took without thinking. That evening, I received a call from an old family friend, a man my husband had worked with for decades. We hadn't spoken since the funeral. I heard you might be moving, he said carefully. I've heard that too, I replied. Your husband asked me to check in if that ever came up. Of course he had. He didn't offer advice. He didn't ask questions. He simply confirmed something I already knew. The next day, a letter arrived with my name on it. Official. Neutral language. A notice of intended changes pending agreement. Pending my agreement. I placed the letter in my folder. At dinner that night, my son mentioned timelines again. We should probably aim for the end of the month, he said. I looked at him and nodded once. Let's make sure everything is in order first, I said. His wife smiled. That's all we want. Later, alone in the guest room, I laid out the documents on the bed. The notice, the clauses, the copies. Each piece fitting together quietly without urgency. They thought cooperation meant surrender. They were about to learn the difference. Because the moment they formalized their plan was the moment my husband's safeguards would take effect. And they were closer than they realized. The change came quietly, the way most important things do. One morning, I noticed my name was missing from the calendar on the refrigerator. Appointments were still there. Meetings, trips, notes written in my daughter-in-law's precise handwriting. Just not me. I didn't say anything. Instead, I paid closer attention. My son started taking phone calls outside. Short conversations, low voice. When I entered the room, he'd end them quickly, saying it was work stuff. His wife began carrying a folder with her, setting it down carefully whenever she sat. I recognized the color. It matched the brochures, the timelines. The plan was moving forward. A letter arrived that afternoon by certified mail. My name was typed neatly across the front. Inside was a formal notice, written in language that sounded considerate while stripping away choice. Proposed changes. Authorization requests. A line at the bottom for my signature. I read it twice. Then I placed it back in the envelope and set it aside. At dinner, my daughter-in-law mentioned the letter casually. "You probably got something in the mail today," she said. "Just standard procedure." "I saw it," I replied. My son looked relieved. "Good. That'll make things easier." Easier. Always that word. That night I went through my folder again. Every page my husband had left behind. Every note he'd written in the margins. One sentence stood out more clearly than before. If they formalize it, the protections activate. I hadn't realized how close we were. The next day, my son asked if I'd signed the document. "Not yet," I said. He frowned. "We don't have much time." "There's always time," I replied. His wife set down her fork. "We're just trying to help you transition smoothly," I nodded. "Of course." But I saw it then. The impatience beneath the politeness. The assumption that resistance meant confusion, not intention. They didn't see me as someone choosing a path. They saw me as someone delaying the inevitable. That afternoon, I received a call from the office downtown. The woman's voice was calm. "They're preparing to move forward," she said. "Once they do, certain controls shift back to you automatically." "How long?" I asked. "Days," she replied. "Possibly sooner." I thanked her and hung up. That evening, I packed a small bag. Nothing noticeable. Just essentials, documents, medication, a change of clothes. I didn't hide it. I placed it in the back of the closet. At dinner, my son announced a meeting scheduled for the following week. "We'll finalize everything then," he said. His wife smiled. "It'll be a relief for everyone." I met her eyes and nodded. "I'm sure it will." Later, alone in the guest room, I sat on the bed and listened to the house. The same walls, the same sounds. But it no longer felt like my home. They thought they were preparing to remove me. What they didn't understand was that the moment they completed their process, they would lose control of it. The word my son had used at that dinner table echoed again in my mind. Decommissioned. They thought it meant I was being shut down. What it actually meant was that the system was about to reset. And this time, I would be the one deciding what came back online. The meeting was set for Monday. My son said it at breakfast, his voice steady, as if he were announcing a routine appointment. His wife nodded, already scrolling through her phone, likely confirming times with someone on the other end. "Everything should be finalized then," she said. "We'll all feel better once it's done." I sipped my coffee. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. Monday gave them confidence. A deadline always does. Over the weekend, they became almost pleasant. My daughter-in-law asked if I wanted anything from the store. My son offered to fix the loose handle on the guest room door. Small gestures. Maintenance gestures. The kind people make when they believe resistance has softened. I let them. On Sunday evening, I took my folder out one last time. I laid the papers across the bed, smoothing each page carefully. Deeds, notes, letters, copies marked with dates and initials. My husband's handwriting guided me through it all, quiet and exact. He had planned for this without bitterness, without accusation, just preparation. That night, I slept lightly but without fear. I woke before dawn, dressed, and placed my small bag by the door. Not to leave, just to be ready. Monday morning arrived clear and cool. My son drove us downtown. His wife sat in the front seat, reviewing notes. I watched the city pass by through the window, noticing how familiar everything still felt. The office building looked the same as before. Neutral. Unassuming. We were led into a conference room with a long table and a glass wall. Coffee had already been set out. Papers were stacked neatly at each place. My son sat straighter than usual. His wife placed her folder in front of her with practiced ease. When the meeting began, they spoke first. They talked about care, about planning, about making things easier. Their words flowed smoothly, rehearsed. They referenced documents, timelines, intentions. Then the woman from the office asked a single question. "Mrs. Harris, do you agree with the proposed changes?" The room went still. I opened my folder and slid one document forward. "Just one. This applies," I said. My son frowned. "I don't think that's relevant anymore." The woman adjusted her glasses and read, slowly, thoroughly. "It's very relevant," she said. My daughter-in-law shifted in her chair. "We were told that was outdated." "It isn't," the woman replied. "And once formal steps are initiated without consent, authority changes." My son looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time in weeks. "What does that mean?" he asked. It means, the woman said calmly, that control reverts. Silence filled the room. Not confusion, not chaos, recognition. I didn't smile, I didn't explain. I simply sat there, hands folded, breathing evenly. They had reached the point my husband had prepared for, the point where their efficiency triggered his safeguard. The meeting ended sooner than expected. On the ride home, no one spoke. I watched the road ahead, steady and clear, feeling neither triumph nor regret. Just balance returning to its place. They had tried to decommission me. Instead, they had activated the part of the system they never knew existed. And now, the next decision would be mine. The shift didn't happen all at once. It started with small things. The next morning, my son didn't leave for work at his usual time. He stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, staring at his phone, rereading messages. His wife sat at the table, her coffee untouched, scrolling without really seeing the screen. No one mentioned the meeting. I moved through the house quietly. I made breakfast for myself. I washed my plate and put it away. No one offered help. No one offered instruction either. The balance had changed. That afternoon, a call came in for me. Not for them. For me. The number was familiar. We've updated the records, the woman said. As of today, decision authority rests with you. I thanked her and hung up. When I returned to the living room, my daughter-in-law looked up quickly. Everything okay? Yes, I said. She studied my face, searching for something. I gave her nothing. By evening, the tension was thick enough to feel. My son tried to make conversation at dinner, mentioning a project at work. His wife nodded at the right moments, but her attention drifted. Finally, she said it. So what happens now? I set my fork down carefully. Now we slow things down. My son frowned. What does that mean? It means nothing changes today, I replied, and nothing will change without my agreement. Silence settled over the table. That wasn't the plan? His wife said, before she could stop herself. I looked at her calmly. I know. That night, I moved back into my old room, not dramatically. I carried my things down the hall one item at a time. A sweater, a book, a framed photo. No one stopped me. No one offered to help. The bed still remembered me. The following day, I scheduled my own appointments. Bank, insurance, doctor. I didn't inform anyone beforehand. I didn't need to. When the mail arrived, my name was on the envelopes again. All of them. My son noticed. Looks like things got rerouted. Yes, I said. He nodded slowly. Okay. It wasn't surrender, it was adjustment. That weekend, I received a call from the assisted living facility. I let it go to voicemail. Later, I returned it politely and declined further contact. On Sunday afternoon, my daughter-in-law approached me in the kitchen. Her tone was different now. Careful. We just want to make sure everyone's comfortable, she said. I am, I replied. She hesitated. And us? I met her eyes. That depends. She swallowed and nodded. That evening, I sat in the living room and watched the sun set through the front window. The same view I'd seen for years. Nothing had changed outside. Inside, everything had. They no longer spoke about timelines. No more folders appeared on the counter. No more brochures. They had learned something important. Decommissioning wasn't removal. It was loss of control. And control had quietly returned to where it belonged. The house settled into a new rhythm after that. Not a peaceful one, just quieter. My son became careful with his words. He asked before making suggestions now. Small questions, neutral ones. His wife stopped rearranging things when she thought I wasn't looking. The folders disappeared. The calendar stayed untouched. They were adjusting to a boundary they hadn't expected. One evening, my son asked if we could talk. Just the two of us. We sat in the living room, the same couch where he used to fall asleep during movies when he was younger. He didn't sit back. He leaned forward, hands clasped, like this was a meeting he hadn't prepared for. I didn't mean for it to go like that, he said. I waited. We were just trying to handle things responsibly, he continued. After Dad passed, everything felt heavy. I know, I said. He looked surprised. You do? Yes. That seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. He ran a hand through his hair. I thought you'd understand. I understood exactly what you were doing, I replied. He looked up at me then. And I let you. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. I wasn't confused, I continued. I wasn't fragile. I was watching. He swallowed. It didn't feel like that. It wasn't meant to, I said. There was a long pause. Finally, he said the thing he'd been circling. Why didn't you stop us sooner? I thought about that for a moment. Because people reveal more when they think they're in control, I said, and I needed to see how far you were willing to go. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. In the kitchen, his wife moved quietly, pretending not to listen. I didn't look at her. I never wanted to hurt you, my son said. I know, I replied, but intention doesn't change impact. He nodded. What happens now? I stood, not abruptly, just decisively. Now, I said, we live differently. That night, I locked my door for the first time since the funeral, not out of fear, out of clarity. The following week, I made changes, subtle ones, necessary ones. I updated beneficiaries, reassigned access, confirmed instructions. Everything was done cleanly, legally, without announcement. They noticed, of course. My daughter-in-law asked fewer questions. When she did, her tone was cautious. One afternoon, she said, "We just want to make sure there's trust." I looked at her. Trust isn't assumed, it's preserved. She nodded, unsure how to respond. The house felt different again, not empty, not tense, just defined. They no longer treated me like someone waiting to be placed. They treated me like someone who might make decisions they couldn't predict. That was enough. One evening, as I turned off the lights, I paused in the hallway. The guest room door stood open, empty, undisturbed. It was just a room again. I went into my bedroom and closed the door behind me. Not softly, not loudly, just firmly. They had tried to decommission me. What they hadn't understood was that I was never a function. I was the foundation, and foundations don't argue when someone tries to move them. They let the weight settle, and then they decide what stands. The morning I made my final decision, the house was quiet in a different way. Not tense, not waiting, settled. I woke early and opened the curtains in my bedroom. Sunlight spread across the floor, touching the dresser my husband and I had picked out decades ago. The same one my daughter-in-law once suggested replacing because it was too bulky. I ran my hand along the edge of it, solid, still doing its job. Downstairs, I made coffee and sat at the table alone. I didn't rush. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Later that day, I told my son I'd be going out for a while. "Do you need a ride?" he asked, careful now. "No," I said. "I'll manage." He nodded. "Okay." That word had changed meaning in this house. I walked through the rooms one last time, not to say goodbye, but to remember. The hallway where height marks were penciled into the wall. The corner where the Christmas tree always leaned slightly because the floor wasn't even. The window my husband liked to stand by in the evenings, hands in his pockets, watching the street. Nothing here had failed me, but nothing here belonged to me anymore either. The decision wasn't dramatic. It wasn't made out of anger or pride. It came from clarity. That afternoon, I signed papers of my own choosing, not rushed, not pressured. I arranged my affairs the way my husband and I once talked about, back when we believed planning was an act of care, not control. I didn't tell my son or his wife right away. That evening, we ate dinner together. Ordinary food, ordinary conversation, no tension, no speeches. Afterward, I stood and cleared my plate. "I'll be moving next week," I said. They both looked up. "Where?" my son asked. "I've arranged a place," I replied. "On my terms." His wife hesitated. "Is it one of the communities we looked at?" "No," I said gently. She nodded, understanding that the answer was final. My son swallowed. "Will we still see you?" I met his eyes. "That depends on how we treat each other going forward." He nodded slowly. "Okay." That night, I packed carefully, only what I needed, only what mattered. I left the rest where it was, not as a loss, but as a choice. On the morning I left, my son carried my bag to the door. He didn't rush. He didn't argue. He simply held it, unsure of what to say. "I didn't mean to make you feel small," he said quietly. "I know," I replied, "but words do that, whether we intend them to or not." At the door, I paused. "You said I was decommissioned," I told him. "What you meant was that you no longer knew where I fit." He nodded. "I fit where I decide," I said. "That hasn't changed." Outside, the air was cool. The street looked the same as it always had. I stepped forward without looking back. Later, alone in my new space, I unpacked slowly. I placed my husband's photo on the dresser. I set my keys down. I opened the window and let the light in. For the first time in months, my chest felt clear. I wasn't angry. I wasn't defeated. I wasn't removed. I had simply reclaimed my place. Because women like me aren't decommissioned. We're just done being taken for granted.